Before we start this review, guys, I'm trying something a little different with the lighting today. Please let me know what you think. That said, let's talk about Beach City Drift, the most recent episode of Steven Universe that aired yesterday, and concluded the first week of the Steven Summer Adventure event. Just 1 week, guys. That's all it's been so far. And it was an interesting episode. I'll say that much about it right out the gate. It was very interesting. It made me think a lot. Though I get the sense that it made me think about some of the wrong things, and I'm going to get to that in a second. The plot of this episode was very straightforward and simple. Greg has a new car, and Steven is sitting in it, making all kinds of puns based on his name. The road isn't big enough for the universe, but the universe is my road. Stuff like that. It was adorable, and we need more of it. More universe puns. Definitely need them. But the important point here is that Greg got a new car. And by a new car, I of course mean a used car, because even though Greg is filthy stinking rich, he's still a practical guy. I love that it's a car that he's had his eye on since like the 80s. Because it shows that while he is going a little overboard with his money, spending a lot of it pretty much right away, he's not buying these outlandish things. He's buying these things that he feels like would make his life a little more complete. Things that he's had his eye on for a long time and just hasn't had the means to acquire. Speaks volumes about the kind of guy that he is. Anyway, we are introduced to this new car at the car wash. Steven, Connie, and Greg are all there. And then up rolls Kevin. Do you remember Kevin from back in Alone Together? The absolute douche nozzle who creeped on Stevani. I remember Kevin. He was a dick. A paper-thin, flat, one-dimensional asshole. And if you were expecting Kevin to get any character development in this episode, you're going to be sadly disappointed because he doesn't. He's still a flat, one-dimensional asshole and the clear antagonist of this episode. A lot of people have been calling this a weakness on the part of the writing in this episode. I completely disagree, and we're going to get to that in a second. Anyway, Kevin's in his cool new yellow sports car. I can't remember what he said it was, but I'm sure it was a reference to some real car. I don't frickin' know. But he's very proud of this car, and he plans to take it out and compete in a very likely illegal street race somewhere in town that same night. And upon seeing Kevin, Steven is visibly hateful. For the first time that I've ever seen him in the show. He came kind of close when he thought Peridot was betraying them. I mean, technically she did betray them, but the point is, he got close in that episode in Message Received. But this is the first time that we see him genuinely hateful towards another human being, and it's kind of scary. And you can tell that Connie's not super happy to see Kevin either. But Steven actually goes up to the guy and tells him off to the point that he leaves. And at this point, Greg turns to Steven and Connie as well, and inquires as to what's up. He doesn't like the fact that Steven is saying outright that he hates this person. He's clearly not happy with Steven for being so angry, but he is such a good parent in this moment because he doesn't just tell Steven off. He doesn't just tell either one of them off. He listens to their grievances, gives them a chance to vent, and then explains to them why their behavior is unnecessary. That's just so good, guys. Greg is such a great parent. I'll tell you, my dad, when I used to get that mad about something, would just yell at me. That's what he'd do. I hope there are parents out there who watch this show with their kids and learn from Greg because he is amazing. That said, as Steven and Connie are talking about what happened at the rave, what Kevin did to them, they're not able to articulate exactly why they feel so strongly about him now because they aren't able to articulate the fact that he violated their consent. They aren't quite mature enough to do that. But that's clearly what he did. That's clearly what Greg realizes that he did, and he clearly is wrestling with himself, trying to decide how thoroughly to explain that to these two young children, relatively young children. And he settles on just telling them that people like Kevin aren't worth their time. They shouldn't worry about him. They shouldn't expend the energy hating him. They should just continue to live their lives. But they have something to work through, so they're not able to do that. And that night, they decide that they really wish that they could race Kevin and show him up. But they're not old enough to drive, so they can't do that. Until Steven remembers that Stevani is physically older, at least in appearance, than Steven and Connie are. So they fuse and commit a little bit of grand theft auto, stealing Greg's car, so that they can go and challenge Kevin to a race. Yes, that's right, guys. Steven and Connie stole a car. They get there, a bunch of the teenagers from town are there, Ronaldo's there. And I want to talk a little bit about Ronaldo here because something interesting happened. He talked to Stevani for like a solid several seconds. And I didn't want to punch him in the face. It's really weird, but it's got to be a one-off thing. So I'm just going to continue talking about the episode, and I'm sure that the next time Ronaldo comes up, I'll have something negative to say about him. So anyway, he goes on and on about how their car is something special, they have no idea what he's talking about, and they go start the race. And Kevin is just being insufferable the entire time that they're setting up for the race. He's coming off as such a straw man. You don't know what that is. That's basically a character who is inserted to represent the negative side of an argument when the writer doesn't really have any interest in examining both sides of the issue. As a pretty extreme example, whenever you see an army of Nazis in television and they're all irredeemably evil with not a single one of them being a guy who's just following orders, those are strawmen. And Kevin definitely comes off as a strawman here, even during the race, where you've got some pretty cool visuals going on and a great score, and some pretty clear homages to Fast and Furious movies and some other big-budget racing thriller movies. We get this scene of Kevin. He's in his car, and he's talking to Stevani through their car windows, and he is just so flat-out evil. He's just such a bad person. There is nothing redeemable about this guy at all, and they're so obvious about it. But again, I'll get to that in a second. Stevani is doing shockingly well in the race. It turns out that their car is surprisingly good at drifting, which is helping them on turns. But then all of a sudden, we get a very similar visual effect to the anxiety effect that we had back in Alone Together, just modified for the fact that they're on a road, symbolizing the fact that the fusion is about to fall apart. Jump cut, and Steven and Connie are sitting together in the driver's seat instead of Stevani. And props to Steven here, because the first thing he asked is if Connie is okay, because we know that the anxiety thing comes from Connie. Very good continuity writers. And we find out, as the two of them talk, that Connie realized that Kevin has too much control over them, that Greg was right. They just had to come to the realization themselves. Kevin's been saying this whole time that Stevani is obsessed with him. And in this scene, Steven and Connie kind of realize that that they've probably been dwelling on his behavior since they met him, and having this opportunity to get back at him is overriding their sense of better judgment. And it really hammers home when Connie points out that the reason that they fused was Kevin. Kevin is why they fused, to try to show him up, and that never should have happened. And so they decide that they need to finish this race, but not for Kevin. They need to do it for themselves. And the way I interpreted that is that they needed some action that they could complete that would metaphorically allow them to put this whole situation behind them. So they complete the race, they lose, but they're in good spirits about it, and Kevin doesn't understand that. He thinks that he's just the greatest thing and that they should be envious of him, and he doesn't understand why they're not. And then as they drive away, he keeps calling after them that they're obsessed, and you come to realize that he's the one who's obsessed with them. Which brings me to the analysis portion of this review, and I'm going to put off the big thing that I want to talk about to the end. There's a couple of smaller things I want to talk about first. First of all, we had some of the Beach City characters watching the race, as I mentioned before, and I just want to talk about them for a second. It was primarily Jenny and Ronaldo. And Jenny was just so cool here. During the period of time that Steven and Connie were stopped on the road talking, she is visibly worried about them and almost reaches the point where she drives up there to check on them. That's just so good of her, and she thinks she's the evil twin. Nah, Jenny's awesome. But then there's Ronaldo, who all throughout the race is just going on and on about how impressed he is with Stevani's car and how he's so thrilled to see it in action. No, wait. That's reasonable. I don't understand what's happening here. Is this an episode where Ronaldo featured where he had no negative impact on the plot? I mean, yeah, he was in Drop Beat Dad and didn't do anything overtly bad, but he wasted all those chips by pouring guacola on it, and that's just unforgivable. But here, I can't think of a single thing that he did that offended me. I must be forgetting something. That's the only explanation. I also really want to praise the themes of this episode. It's very clear that they were going for a discussion of the importance of consent. It's very clear that the violation of consent is the feeling that Steven and Connie are trying to articulate towards the beginning of the episode. And I like the fact that they're not able to articulate it. And that because of that, they're not able to articulate why they don't like Kevin. Because there are some kinds of people that it's okay to dislike without being able to articulate why. Kevin just reads as a scummy person. It's okay to dislike scummy people. Which brings me to the big point that I want to discuss here, and that's Kevin. First of all, what they did right with Kevin. I mentioned message received earlier, and that was on purpose, because there was another moment in message received that I think informed this episode. When it seems like Peridot is betraying them, because technically she was, after it's revealed that she took the diamond communication device without telling anyone. Garnet tells Steven that something along the lines of how it's good to believe in people, but some people aren't deserving of that. And that's something that I've been saying about this show for a long time, that there need to be antagonists that aren't redeemed. And it seems like the show has decided to make up for lost time by giving us a couple of those pretty close together, that being Marty and Kevin. Is Kevin kind of a straw man? Yes. Is he a one-dimensional antagonist? Absolutely. But there are just some people who are like that. There are some people who are irredeemable assholes. No, not quackholes, assholes. Who keeps doing that? Okay. I'm going to imagine that didn't happen and move on. Back on topic, I like the idea that Kevin is an irredeemable person because there are some people who are just like that. They don't care about anybody but themselves, they're very obvious about it, and they're not likely to change anytime soon. There's a scene pretty much smack dab in the middle of their race where Kevin lies about this sob story about a brother that he doesn't even have. There are even people who do stuff like that. In a show that is so representative of different kinds of people, they needed to show some people like this because these kinds of people exist. But then there were some aspects of the story revolving around Kevin that they didn't handle well. And most of those, surprisingly enough, involve Stevonnie. First of all, it really seems like the episode is trying to imply that when they're fused into Stevonnie, that even though Stevonnie's components are underage, Stevonnie themselves is not. That somehow they are older than Steven or Connie, not just physically but in terms of their maturity level as well. And that's absolutely ridiculous. And yet the episode clearly implies that that's the intention when Steven and Connie decide that they'll be old enough to drive if only they fuse. And I wouldn't mind that so much, I'd brush it off as just kind of a casual joke. If it weren't for all of the subtext and everything that Kevin says to them. Everything he says to Stevonnie has these sleazy sexual undertones. You've had a taste of me and now you're obsessed. It feels like he's hitting on them. In an episode where he acknowledges that he understands that they're two minors combined into one person. That just comes off as very cringy to me. I don't want to go so far as to say that they're writing him as a pedophile, but it definitely feels like they wanted the interactions between these two characters to have these sexual undertones and tried to excuse the fact that Stevonnie is underage. The only word I can think of to adequately describe this is gross. It's gross and it made me feel gross. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who didn't see the subtext, and that's perfectly fine. But I definitely saw it, and I'm sure there are a lot of other people who did too. Some of them who, sadly, might have experienced something like this before. And I feel like this really shouldn't have been here, not for me and the people who didn't see the subtext, but for them, out of consideration for them. Or I'm reading too much into it. That is kind of what I do. Let's get a discussion about that in particular, and everything else that I talked about in this review, going in the comment section down below. Anyway, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.